now. So we can begin. Thank you everyone for coming to today's webinar on shared parental leave and breastfeeding in higher education institutions, hosted by York St John University. So to introduce myself, my name is Alexandra Dales. I'm the School Research Knowledge Transfer Lead at York Business School of York St John University. And we have Anjali, Raj and Ernestine, Gheyoh and Ndzi, who will be joining us. Well, I'll let them introduce themselves. I just want to, I'm going to open up a poll because we'd really like your thoughts on shared parental leave and breastfeeding in HEIs. So I'm going to open that up, and while I'm just explaining, doing some housekeeping and then getting Ernestine and Anjali to introduce themselves, I'd be very grateful if you could just complete that poll. I'm just launching it, so hopefully you'll be able to access it. So please input your answers. So just on a housekeeping note, you'll see that there is a live transcript of the meeting created. Some of the transcription is not always accurate, so if you get some strange words there coming in, those can be corrected afterwards, but that's why they might occur. I think you can individually on your own screen answer that. I can see someone's raised a hand, so if you just hold on, I will, if there's any issue, I can try and help. If you do have the chat function, so if you have a chat, I can see, I'm sorry that I can see that some people can't accept, the answers aren't being accepted. If you keep going, try again, or you're able to, if you're happy to add in the chat, or we can, oh dear, I'm sorry about that. I can see the poll isn't quite working. Perhaps if Anjali or Ernestine could ask Becky, who might be able to assist on that if the poll is not working. We do, so if you we'll come back to that. Thank you for adding in your answers in the chat if you can't enter the poll. The other thing I wanted to say is please use the chat as a area for you to ask for questions or add a comment at a particular stage within the presentation. We do have a Q&A button. Please click on that, and because we'd really like your feedback and thoughts and comments and questions, and we can come to those at the very end. And I can ask those questions directly to Ernestine and Anjali. So please bear in mind you can add comments in the chat, but for the end of webinar discussion, please write your questions in the Q&A. Thank you to everybody who is making notes in the chat area. I appreciate that if the poll hasn't quite worked, I'm sorry about that, but thank you very much for your patience in doing that. Right now, I won't go on anymore, so I would like to introduce Anjali, and perhaps you could introduce yourself and explain what you're doing in your relationship with research, and then I'll turn to Ernestine.
Thank you. Hello everyone, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Anjali and I'm an associate lecturer with York St John. So my interest in breastfeeding and obstetrics comes from the fact that I'm an antenatal educator, I'm a breastfeeding counselor. So that's my professional side, but I teach healthcare management and business. So breastfeeding and caring for mothers, gender equality, these are areas that I'm extremely passionate about. And hence I joined Ernestine on this research with her. So I'm really happy that all of you have joined us here, and I hope you like our study. Thank you.
Hi everybody, welcome to our webinar. So Ernestine, well, I'll keep it as Ernestine, but it's Ernestine Gheyoh. So I'm a senior lecturer in the law with the York Business School. Shared parental leave, gender equality, everything is really something I'm very passionate about. So everything shared parental leave and all the challenges or all other things that comes with it, and that's how it extends into breastfeeding. So those are the areas that I research and I teach in other things. Let's not go into what I teach, but we'll leave it there for this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. And just to add, I relaunched the polls, and I've got 25 out of 44. So please do answer the poll now. It seems to have worked again and be relaunching. Thank you very much. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Ernestine, who will be discussing shared parental leave and breastfeeding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anjali, please, could you help us with the slide? Thank you. So why are we here today? So what we're looking at, the key role that women have been playing in the labor market, obviously triggered concerns around gender equality in the workplace. And we know that really talking about gender equality in the workplace, it won't really work unless we have the right policies and the right practices in place. We need the right workplace culture for this to work. Whilst breastfeeding is a natural law, because obviously women, the key thing we know about women is they go off at one point or another to have babies, which is a very natural law, but it doesn't, the breastfeeding side of it doesn't tend to come that natural when it comes to policies and workplace support and so on. So whilst the government, whilst the UK as a whole is trying to push, or whilst even the society is trying to push for gender equality in the workplace, there is a massive element of it that seems to have gone unnoticed, which is that breastfeeding part of it. We have seen the introduction of shared parental leave, which signals that policymakers are also interested in pushing the agenda of gender equality in the workplace. Shared parental leave gives the mother the choice to share her maternity leave with her partner. And it only means that the maternity leave will be shortened. In the UK, maternity leave is 52 weeks. So sharing that, it means the leave will be shortened. Now, while shared parental leave and breastfeeding are two separate things, but really they are very much interrelated. There is a policy on shared parental leave, but there isn't a national policy on breastfeeding in the workplace that will take into account everything that starts from risk assessment to resources that is required. We know that under the health and safety policy, it talks about rest breaks and it talks about risk assessment for pregnant women and breastfeeding women, but that's as far as it goes. So without having a national policy that covers everything, you start to see a tension between shared parental leave and breastfeeding. Why? The central key here being the woman, the central key here also being the workplace. So, but why did we choose higher education? There is a perception that in higher education, because we teach, we have so much departments, don't we? We teach all sorts of people, we produce presidents, we produce HR people, we produce all sorts of things. So there's a presumption or a perception that higher education should be able to do better when it comes to things like this, when it comes to supporting mothers in the workplace. So we thought it would be really interesting to try and look into this and analyze and see whether that support really, whether that perception translates into reality. And that is what we'll be talking through this webinar today. Next slide, please. So what you will see is from what we'll be presenting to you today, we've collected data both from secondary and primary sources. So for our secondary data, we first of all downloaded the list of universities that we have on the uni guide. And from that, from those universities, we went looking on university websites, look at universities that have published their policies on shared parental leave and breastfeeding. So we collected that to analyze. And just to flag up to you that the findings we'll be presenting to you will be findings from universities that made those policies publicly available. For primary source of data, we did do an online survey. Although it did not retain as many as would have loved to have, we had 79 responses, but some of the responses were incomplete, so we had to cut them out. We also did semi-structured interviews with 20 mothers with 20 women who have had babies and been working in higher education on or before the 5th of April 2015. Why that timeline? Because then that's when shared parental leave also came into force. So it captures their eligibility for shared parental leave as well. We also did a freedom of information request to all the universities to collect data for the past 5 academic years on the number of mothers that have taken maternity leave and the number of parents, now call it parents because it's not specific to mothers, but the number of parents that have taken shared parental leave in the past 5 academic years. So what we will be presenting, you will see that this is a lot of data that we have. What we'll be doing or presenting to you today is a snapshot from what we have analyzed from this. A lot more analysis will be done and will be publishable, but we're giving you highlights today. So just to start with the policies, we'll start with shared parental leave policies. So when we went looking, what we identified was out of all the universities, 125 universities, only 66 universities had made their policies on shared parental leave publicly available. One thing for those of you who know or may not know, shared parental leave is one of the most complex and bureaucratic policy when it comes to family-friendly policies that exist. So it needs it needs understanding. It needs someone who knows to understand exactly what it is all about, which is what drove us to look at these policies. Now, we were looking at it in terms of the number of pages. You will see that policies ranged from 1 page to over 21 pages. Now, over 21 pages starts to tell you how detailed some of these policies can be. But what we found rather not very adequate were those that had just a single line. It wasn't even up to a page, a single line on the website, which rather directed their staff to the government website. Now it starts to raise questions about understanding, it starts to raise questions about how much staff will be able to read it, to understand it, and the practicality side of things. We found that 12 universities provided examples. And as we go through, you will see that one of the key things that mothers talked about was the fact that universities or employers that actually sat them down to explain the practicalities and give them examples of what it looks like. That is what helped them. But most of the universities who don't do so still leave colleagues or staff not knowing what to do, not knowing how it will really be applicable to them. So 30 universities within their policies had all the relevant forms. Now that was also good because if you think about policies that don't have the forms, it means that staff will need to go looking for the forms or start emailing HR for the forms, which really doesn't make life that easy either. Next slide, please. And then one of the biggest issues with shared parental leave has always been the fact that it's not paid very well. So looking at the 66 universities that we looked at their policies, 37 of these universities enhance shared parental leave pay, which is great. But if you look at the graph that we got on the screen, you will see the kind of differences between universities, how many weeks that they enhance the pay for. Now, whilst we have a university there, which we're not going to disclose the name, once we have 2 universities that were enhancing up to 24 weeks, which is great, you can see that other analysis, it really drives people, which it's something we'll pick up in the interview section. See, it really then drives people to take shared parental leave. Otherwise, you see they can only go for the number of weeks that is available. Now, one of the issues that we found rather interesting is that 5 universities were requesting employees to discuss any issues of shared parental leave with their line manager first. It raises the question of how much the line manager knows. If they know about the shared parental leave, that's brilliant. But it's a question that we might want to think about it when we're talking about the interview findings. 28 universities requested that employees should get in touch with the HR team. Well, to us, we were looking at it as a signal, that level of support, acknowledging that shared parental leave is quite complex. So it signaled that support, that come and talk to us after reading the policy, and we are going to talk you through it or answer any questions if you have any. So this is a very, very quick analysis of what we did from the shared parental leave policies, but there's much more to it, unfortunately, which we don't have time to talk about today. Anjali, please.
So I'll take over into the breastfeeding side now. So the way we analyzed the SPL policies, we did the same with the breastfeeding ones as well. And what we realized is that only 35 universities had their policy on breastfeeding publicly available. And this information was spread across various locations. And this was very interesting because for women to actually find where their breastfeeding rooms are or what the university policy is, there was a host of spaces that they had to go to. So the maximum was, most of them were either on a policy web page or on the equality, diversity, inclusivity pages, which is interesting and good. But however, if you see the range of the rest, there's a separate web page somewhere, there is on the recruitment pages, sometimes it's part of SPL. So it just makes it a lot more complicated for the person who is actually trying to look for the information. So that's a challenge that we've identified. And going forward into the number of breastfeeding rooms, so 23 of the universities had dedicated breastfeeding rooms. 9 of them had multi-purpose rooms that can be used for breastfeeding. So this is something like a first aid room or a wellness room. And so it's not only for breastfeeding mothers, which meant that, let's say someone had an accident and wants to use the first aid room, then the mother can't use it. Or, it's been used by multiple people. And in some universities, it was also the prayer rooms, which again arises challenges as to the breastfeeding mothers having to work around other situations and issues. 8 of the universities have a combination of dedicated rooms and other rooms, which in some ways is best of both worlds, because if you think about it, universities that have large campuses, you do need a mix of options so that women don't have to, let's say, walk from one end of the campus to the other to actually access a room. So this was a split of breastfeeding rooms that we noticed. Top performers, so when we counted the number of rooms, in terms of all rooms together, University College London tops the list. They have 32 combined rooms. This by combined rooms, I mean breastfeeding rooms, dedicated rooms, private rooms that can be booked for breastfeeding, all of that together. They have 32 options that they have listed. And second comes University of Arts in London, which has 15 rooms of the same combination. Now, when we look at specific dedicated rooms only, then King's College London topped the list because they have 6 dedicated rooms only for breastfeeding and expressing milk. Amongst the rest of the universities, it's an average of only 2 rooms per campus. And so you can see that there's an extreme gap between our top performers and the rest. Now, having 2 rooms per campus brings us back to the same challenge I was discussing previously on what if your office is a 15-minute walk away from where the campus breastfeeding room is. Now, that means that you're going to spend 15 minutes to and 15 minutes fro just walking, and then which leaves you with not much time to actually sit and express breast milk. So how are you going to manage that with the rest breaks that you have? So these are all very logistical challenges that come up, which have not been thought out with very few rooms on a large campus. Accessibility and storage. So with breast milk, once you express it, you also need to store it. So even though there were so many, there are 32 rooms or 15 rooms and all of these numbers, and 35 universities have given details, only 15 of them actually have facility to store the milk, which means that, okay, if your baby is in the nursery on campus, you could go to the room, breastfeed. But what if you are a mother who expresses milk? Then only 15 of them actually have a fridge and a storage to store that milk. 13 universities required prior booking on advance request to access the rooms. Now, this is a bit of a double-edged sword, because in a way, if you have booked it prior, that means that you have the room for yourself. You don't have to worry about it. You can go and use it. The flip side being, if you forget to book it, or if someone else has booked it, then you are at a loss. So the prior booking has a double-edged issue to it. It was the University of Glasgow where they explicitly state that their breastfeeding room was only for expressing milk and not breastfeeding. So if the mother has brought the baby to the university, she can't use that to breastfeed. That was a specification that was mentioned amongst all the universities that we saw. And now moving on to the survey data. So that was, like Ernestine mentioned, out of all the literature we had, those were the key points that we felt we should share. And the same with the survey. So we had 49 fully completed questionnaires. And with the SPL, most of the people actually, they knew what it is, or at least they have some knowledge of it. Whereas when you're going to where they heard about it, again, there's a big range. And there's almost the number of people who have learned about SPL from the employer, or the article newspaper, or the website is the same. So which kind of gets you thinking that aren't employers doing enough? Because ideally, because of shared parental leave, the knowledge they got from the employers would ideally be the highest number. But here it's the same number in terms of websites and newspapers. When it comes to policies in the workplace, 71% of mothers had heard of it. They knew what it was. And there's the rest 25 who are not very sure about. On the flip side, in terms of breastfeeding policies, majority of the mothers did not know if a policy exists, or they did not have a policy. Now, this is where the linkage between shared parental leave and breastfeeding also comes in. I might know there's a shared parental leave policy, but it's difficult to access. I don't even know there is a breastfeeding policy. So how am I actually going to utilize these benefits? So the awareness and knowledge was a very key finding that we got in the survey. Few others. So one of our assumptions was that maybe income has a big role in people who take SPL and people who don't. If you look at joint family income, actually the baselines were similar for women who took SPL and those who did not. So that was one of our assumptions that was a bit challenged. Majority of women returned to work between 25 and 39 weeks, or after 40 weeks. So we know that even within the mothers who took shared parental leave, none of them took it before 25 weeks, or very few people took it before 25 weeks. Only 3 out of the 35 women who did not take shared parental leave said that return to work will not affect breastfeeding. So again, we can see there's a very clear link between the decision to take SPL and their breastfeeding choices and their assumptions of whether it will affect their breastfeeding practice. 44 of 49 women, and this is a really high number, had seen absolutely no signposting for breastfeeding facilities at the workplace. Again, there's a very visual thing. They may know that there might be a policy on breastfeeding, but they had never seen any form of signposting for facilities where they work. So that's another challenge as well. I'll pass it on to Ernestine now.
Thank you, Anjali. So to put the data and the findings into perspective, we also looked at the number of women who had taken maternity leave in the past 5 academic years, and the number of parents that took shared parental leave, as I mentioned earlier. So the freedom of information was sent to all universities, and 32 universities out of the 125 did not respond to our request. But out of the rest that responded, there are some that the data was not complete, so we couldn't use the data. So we got rid of the ones that we couldn't use and only used the data that we could. Now, what you will realize looking at the graphs that you've got on screen is for the past 5 years, the cumulative number, we have the University College London being the highest being the university with the highest number of mothers that took maternity leave. Well, we've also just heard that they are the highest with breastfeeding rooms, combined breastfeeding rooms. We already know nationally that it's not something that is only about the higher education sector, but nationally, uptake of shared parental leave is very low. But we have University of Cambridge topping the chart with 269. And the big question is, what is it that they are doing that others are not doing, which is something that we would like to investigate further in our research as well. So some of the universities, the information that they sent back to us was indicating that they do count shared parental leave as part of maternity leave, which is completely not correct. And also we did not use that information within this analysis. Next, please. So once we have been talking through policy analysis and what matters, analysis, what matters the most is how these policies, all this that we've been talking about, how does it really impact on the mother's experiences? And that is what we're going to go now into very quickly, talking about the interview findings. Next slide, please. So our findings, we sort of put it more into kind of like pre-pregnancy, before the woman was pregnant, during when she was pregnant, when she was in maternity leave, and when she returned. So the findings were grouped into that to make it easy for us to kind of follow the trend and how the experiences also have been. So those that were aware of the women who said they were aware of shared parental leave, they said they mostly heard about it from government campaigns. And some of them had heard of shared parental leave from friends. And those that heard about shared parental leave from friends had a little bit more information about how it could actually work for them in practice. But the majority of people had not really heard about it before then. We had only one interviewee who actually pointed out that they knew about shared parental leave because their employer had sent around some information. Now, going back to that natural law of a woman having a child and breastfeeding, interestingly, we had the vast majority of the women saying that they don't really know what the policies are on breastfeeding in the workplace, although they knew what the legal right is, or what the legal right is to breastfeed. They know they have the right to breastfeed, but when it comes to the legal right to breastfeed in the workplace or to express, they don't know what it is. So there were key questions around what is needed in terms of the time they want to take to express, where to store the milk. It was very much unclear amongst the mothers. Next, please. So while mothers became pregnant and they notified their employers that they were pregnant, so conversations will start. So conversations will initially start with the line manager as expected, of course. But what we found out was that those initial conversations doesn't go into these topics such as shared parental leave and breastfeeding. And we know that it is at those initial stages that information on something like shared parental leave is crucial, because the mother will have to make a decision. Although discussion around breastfeeding is also very crucial at that point, because then mothers can start to decide what form of feeding they might want to adopt, but also having that conversation later on was very crucial. So for them, most of them, those initial conversations did not bring, none of these key points, none of the key points came up. Now, in terms of HR support and HR knowledge, what we found out from the interviews is that HR, there's a mixed picture there, because there are some HR that they know about the policies, they know what they need to do, and they're very, very supportive of their staff. But still, a vast number of the mothers that we spoke to said their HR did not know. There was very little understanding of what shared parental leave was, talk less of supporting them to take the shared parental leave or even giving them information on that. And there was very little support when it came to breastfeeding. Again, going back to the fact that there was no breastfeeding, or there's no breastfeeding policy in the workplace, HR don't know what to do, and so there isn't much support for them. Information accessibility. So all that leads into information accessibility. As mentioned earlier, shared parental leave is very complex, and almost all the mothers reported finding it very difficult to access and understand. The problem with shared parental leave was the fact that they couldn't understand it, but the problem with breastfeeding was that the policy doesn't even exist in the first place. Next, please. So whilst maternity leave is an unquestionable leave for a mother to take, certain factors still impact on how long a mother can take a leave. So when we started to explore what decisions or what are the factors that impact on a mother's decision, we saw that the things like financial constraint. We know financial constraint is a big thing for shared parental leave because it's paid at a basic rate, but we also found that if the workplace is enhancing maternity leave, it also determines how long a mother might want to take maternity leave. So if a university is enhancing maternity leave, say for 6 months, a mother might want to take just that for 6 months because of financial constraint. So another interesting point is that we also found that mothers really don't want to share their leave, so they don't want to reduce the leave. Now, there were a number of reasons why they may not want to do that, but top of the list was also breastfeeding. They were thinking of the lack of support. How will they manage breastfeeding? They really want to breastfeed, so they then tend not to share their leave. One of the key points, which I probably think is very interesting and probably has gone unnoticed for a long time when determining the factors that will influence a mother's decision on when to come back, was the fact we picked up on the fact that there's not adequate cover for mothers. So because there's no adequate covers for mothers, it pushes mothers, not necessarily because they want to return to work early, but it pushes them to want to return to work early so as to sort of mitigate the negative impact staying away might have on their work or career as a whole. Although a mother tends to get cover when it comes to teaching when they're going on leave, but things like research and PhD supervision and research activities, very little support. Mothers tend to get very little support. And we then saw that some people, whilst on maternity leave or shared parental leave, then have to be working just to make sure that their research projects don't suffer, that their research students don't suffer. Next, please. So on return to work, many women felt that they were not adequately supported or reintroduced into the workplace. Some also even felt that there was not adequate keeping in touch. They were not keeping in touch days for some of the mothers. And what that meant is that when they came back, they felt like they don't know, they're not up to speed, they've lost, they don't know what is going on. And there wasn't that much support to really reintroduce them back into work. Whilst pregnancy and maternity leave is kind of acceptable natural law, the natural law of breastfeeding seemed to be completely neglected as mothers talked about the fact that they had to push for support in terms of resources that they need to use to continue breastfeeding whilst they are back at work. Now, the big question is, what about those who don't have that courage to push? Does that mean they will have to give up breastfeeding? The big question as well is, do they have to push? Now, interestingly, one of the participants said they only provided her with the resources because the institution was applying for Athena Swan accreditation. Should that be the reason for providing a resource to mothers? That's a question for us to think about. Next, please. So women's decision as to when to stop breastfeeding also depended very heavily on the support that is available in the workplace. So a number of the women were still breastfeeding at the time of the interview, and they reported that they were only able to continue for as long as they did because of the opportunity to work from home that the pandemic had presented them with. So for those that went to work before the pandemic, or those that had to go to work for one reason or the other, they reported stopping breastfeeding because expressing at work was often too difficult for them, or too difficult because of the lack of the resources. So most of the mothers thought that workplace do not understand or empathize with the tiredness and the uninterrupted sleep and the fact that there's a new baby, that most workplaces were unsympathetic. Although we had some mothers who expressed the fact that their workplaces were fantastic at supporting them in that respect. Some thought that as a result of the exhaustion, they felt like their careers was being impacted upon negatively. Next, please. So following that, then the big question now we have is, like I said at the very beginning, shared parental leave is on its own as a policy. We have breastfeeding, but unfortunately, or rather fortunately, they've got that relationship. There's that intersectionality between them that really can't be split if we really start to talk about gender equality and really giving the women and supporting women in the workplace. So does really shared parental leave impact on breastfeeding, or does breastfeeding impact on shared parental leave? The first answer is yes. It does impact on shared parental leave does impact on breastfeeding and vice versa. So breastfeeding also impact on shared parental leave uptake where there is lack of support in the workplace. However, the situation will not be the same where there is support in the workplace. There will be no impact. So then it leaves us with this question of what part do HE institutions and Athena Swan has to play, because Athena Swan Charter has a lot to do with encouraging and promoting women in the workplace and doing, I'm not going to go into that, but we know what the role of Athena Swan is. And given that it came up in the study as well, the big question is, what role have they got to play as far as this is concerned? Next slide, please. So what we did was we collected recommendations when we spoke to the mothers to try and understand what they thought will be the best for them. So they talked about universities to provide detailed explanations and examples of what shared parental leave is, actually how it will work in their scenarios in real life. And the interesting thing is that they were talking about a stigma. There is a stigma in universities around shared parental leave. So much less there's a stigma around breastfeeding in the workplace as well. So they're talking about universities more coming out to change the work culture, to make it acceptable in the workplace. So enhanced pay. Now we've talked about shared parental leave, which pay isn't very good. We know that more than 85% to 90% of all universities do enhance maternity pay. The question is, why can't they enhance shared parental leave pay as well? There's that big cry, not only to universities, but there's that big cry to the policymakers, the government as a whole. So there is need for improved facilities, or for workplaces to provide facilities. Like we pointed at the very beginning, there isn't a national policy on breastfeeding that takes this all into account. But if we were to go back to the whole reason why we were focusing on the education, the higher education sector anyway, we see that this is where we teach everything. This is where we do research, everything. This is where we influence policies, we make changes. Why can't it start with higher education, even if the policymakers, the government as a whole, isn't very ready or it's not doing anything yet? Why can't we be the first people to make this as a kind of a policy that is unique, if we want to put it that way, across higher education institutions? So they talked about timing for information sharing. Like I mentioned earlier, most of the mothers who want information on shared parental leave at that very initial stage is where they inform the line managers that they are expecting a child. They want that information at that point. They want information on breastfeeding as well. But we know, besides that, breastfeeding is something that people might want to do it, but for some people, it doesn't just work for one reason or the other. So for that reason, again, at the point of returning to work, where a mother is returning to work, it is critical at that point that all information about breastfeeding, where the rooms are, what support is there for them, they want that information at that stage. The mother shouldn't be left to be the one to ask, to be the one to push, because it is not all mothers that have that or will feel that comfortable to be able to do so. Next, please. Increased support for flexible working upon returning to work. Again, we talked about the exhaustion from feeding, the exhaustion from having a newborn baby at home who's probably crying, you don't sleep very well. So we know at the moment that flexible working is only a right to request. And so employers do turn it down. So there's a call, there's an outcry. And like I said, this is only highlight. This is an outcry because it's still a very big problem. Not all mothers who need that flexible working are getting it. So there's still a big outcry for employers to consider granting flexible working requests for mothers. Line managers should have additional training. They should have at least some basic information of what it should be. We don't need, or they don't need line managers to be experts in the policies, to be experts about different things, but need line managers to, at the very least, to be able to signpost the staff, the mother, the employee, where they can get X and Y. They should be very open and supportive. In fact, it's not just about thinking about, oh, what will you be teaching or what are you researching, but more about how are we going to help you with the other things? Because being as a mother, your life changes. You've moved from, well, if you were single, things doesn't just fall back into place when you come back to work. You have a lot of other things to do. Continuous check-in from HR managers and bodies on returning to work. So again, going into the details of the interviews that we had. So many of the mothers actually said coming back to work, having a body is what actually worked for some of them, because they couldn't find, for example, policies on breastfeeding, couldn't find what to do, but because they knew a group, or there was an existing group in the institution, or they knew someone who had been there, they had to go to that someone to say, what do I do about this? And again, it also flags up, because where the line manager, where the HR don't give that information when it is needed, it forces people, first of all, something like breastfeeding, which unfortunately the UK has the lowest breastfeeding rate, and breastfeeding has been taken to be something else in the UK, unfortunately. It means that people find it more comfortable and much easier to turn to their colleagues and friends rather than go to their line managers to talk through what they need and get that adequate support. There was an outcry for support for research. We had a number of participants who worked in the STEM subject. We had some that were research heavy in terms of what they do, and there was a real outcry in terms of support for research. We also had someone from the professional services who felt that they are not listened to, like more they listen to academics more than they listen to them. They don't get the support that academics get. And the big question is, should there be a disparity in the workplace in something like this, which is quite unique, which is, like I said, a natural law for a woman is. Next, please. And just around this, to round it up, so there's a call for particularly for shared parental leave, for there to be an independent and separate leave between the mother and the child, like is in the other countries. But we as researchers, we're calling on Athena Swan to really consider in terms of their assessments, in terms of when people are applying for Athena Swan accreditation and so on, one of the key things we want that Athena Swan Charter should really take into consideration is breastfeeding. Now, there will be really no equality in the workplace if the fact that a woman can have a child and if the fact that a woman can breastfeed is ignored. So that's one of the biggest problems, and we hope that the Athena Swan organization can really take this point into account. Sorry, that was a bit of a real quick ramble, but that's a snapshot of the initial analysis that we've done. Thank you, and we're open for questions now.
Thank you. Thank you, Ernestine and Anjali. I really enjoy listening to all that, although I'm familiar with the research, and we've received lots of questions. We've got 11 questions, and there's lots of comments in the chat, which have been really interesting, and I'm going to make sure I catch everyone. And I think you can hopefully also be able to see the Q&A comments, but I'll start. There's some early comments, so I'll just start with this first one. Are there any policies of breastfeeding elsewhere in the world? So I'm sure there must be, but I wondered if you could give a comment on that, and I shall just have a look at the next questions.
So in terms of higher education institutions, I have to admit I'm not aware of any. Corporates do have breastfeeding policies, but it's not a nationalized policy. It depends on the individual organization. So breastfeeding worldwide is a legal right. So you is a legal right to have that time, breaks at work to express. But how is that curtailed in terms of the finer bits of the policy? There is nothing that is standardized. It is dependent on the organization, is dependent sometimes on the HR. And I do know from industry experience that for some companies, depending on which country you're based in, the policies are different. So it is very, very localized, and hence why, especially for higher education, we are calling for a policy which is going to be applicable to all higher education institutions in the UK.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. And Balfetti had asked that question. I'm just going to say one point before I move to the next question. Please do stay to the very end of the webinar, because there'll be another poll that will come up automatically at the end of the webinar, that has some additional questions, partly in response to what we've talked today. And we'd really be glad of your thoughts. There's some narrative questions in there. So please do stay at the end, and please do answer that second poll. It does really help to get your feedback. So Mark Gheyoh has asked a question. I think part of it was answered. He had asked, sort of, perhaps I'll go for the second part, is whether any patterns in who published and who did not, e.g. were more generous policies published. And that's from Mark Gheyoh. And he also asked he said, oh yes, that's it. The first half of my question would be answered. Are you able to comment on that?
Yeah, I can. So for I don't know if the question is specific to shared parental leave or breastfeeding, but I'll talk about both. So like we said, the universities that publish, let me start with shared parental leave. We had 66 universities that published their policies on shared parental leave. We still to do more in-depth analysis to look at groups of universities, see what's happened, but across, there was no real sense to it in terms of the fact that they were too generous. That's why they published it. That's not what we gathered, because like I said on the graph that we had in the presentation, we had universities that had just one line somewhere on the website saying that see the link to government website, and government website, we know how tedious the policy itself is, and it's not enhanced at all. For some universities, they kind of knit, or they refer to maternity leave policy as shared parental leave policy, which we know that is not true, and that's very confusing for staff. So in terms of breastfeeding, just like Anjali said, we didn't have many universities as well that published their information. But again, we saw quite a divergence and a picture in terms of we had University College London, which was topping the chart with 32 breastfeeding rooms across the campus, but we had others who were just like one or two, but not really a dedicated room. They would talk about a first aid room or a prayer room and say they should go and use it. So it's not that the ones that published it were generous in any way. Maybe they just published it, but we still to do even more in-depth analysis on those.
Thank you for that. There are a couple of questions that I'm going to try and pull together because they're partly methodological. So one from, again, Balfetti was were breastfeeding rooms commonly shared by students and staff? I know Hannah Matum had asked, were there any similarities or differences of experience between academics and professional staff? And there just another comment in terms of when you had the pointed data where it was for the average was 2 rooms per university, obviously that may look good if you've got a very small university and less good if it's a large university. So I was wondering if you could just comment on those points. I'm just trying to pull together a few of the methodological and sort of querying of the information.
Sure. I'll pull the first and the third, as Ernestine can answer the second. So I'll quickly say yes, there were rooms shared by students and staff. So out of the publicly available 33 universities, there were 6 of the universities which was student and staff combined. Now, for the other universities, we are not sure if it is combined or not because they haven't mentioned it, but 6 of them were explicitly for both students and staff. And in terms of size of campus, yes, that did, I wondered that as well. So when I was looking at the university, I did look at their campus and the size. And to be honest, that wasn't a concern because there was very few, in fact, none of the universities that we looked at were a single building or 2 building universities. They were mostly campuses or minimum of 4 or 5 buildings around the space. So yes, I hope that answers the question.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you to everyone for asking. We've got lots coming through still. So I'm just going to try and just work through them. And I think we've got enough time, hopefully, to cover them all. But there's a question, just if you give a brief answer on, could we hear more about perspectives on the provision of research cover, who and how research cover was arranged, and the difficulties of support given when returning from parental leave. So perhaps you had a minute on that, but either one, Anjali or Ernestine.
Yes. That's fine. I'll take that one. Now, the issue with the research cover was, and I think, no, I don't want. There were a few of them. Some of the people that we talked to were kind of research was a big part of their contract, and others it was kind of split 50-50. Now, the key point was that when going on maternity leave, the initial conversations before they go was very heavily teaching. What are we going to do to cover your teaching till you can? And there was no discussion around what's going to happen with your research, what's going to happen with the PhD students that you've got, what's going to happen with this research funding that you've got going, and you've got this deadline, what do you do with it? So there was most of the participants said there was really no support around that, and that is why they felt when they actually went on maternity leave, some of them felt like obliged to carry on working, like supervising students, or particularly where they have papers that had to go at a certain time, or those milestones that had to be hit at a particular time. They felt like they were compelled to do that because there was no support offered to them as well. And this wasn't said, but I wonder also whether, because nothing like that was said, I wondered also whether people didn't feel comfortable trying to ask, so what are you going to do for me for my research, and so on and so forth. So there's that heavy focus on covering teaching, but very little talk about research, and one talking about the fact that now we are all expected to do research, to submit for ref and do this and that, but yet there isn't much support in place. And research funders as well, I think that was mentioned in the interviews, they are not very friendly in supporting staff who've got research funding and going on maternity leave.
Thank you, Ernestine. I think that's a sort of a familiar strain in many of these discussions. I have another question. Where there are examples of, were there examples of making a business case for more breastfeeding rooms, resources, support? Currently in my higher education institution, implementing EDI initiatives requires a business case. And that, so I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
So there weren't any example that we saw or during the interview that came up. However, if you want to make a business case for breastfeeding support, I'll be more than happy to help with that, because it links into productivity, it links into employer retention, and even recruitment, because all the data we found on breastfeeding policies were all publicly available data. So if tomorrow I'm looking for a job in a university, I'm going to look at the publicly available data. And so it's going to have an impact on your recruitment, it's going to have an impact on retention. So I can help you make a business case for it, but no, we didn't see any examples.
Thank you, Anjali. Okay, another question here, just in terms of the spatial area, any comments, or have you considered questions relating to parking of expectant mothers and mothers who recently gave birth? We've tried to convince the university to either create some or have at least give permission for such categories to share disabled parking, however did not succeed. So again, that speaks to that the spatial sensitivity of the needs of staff and employees.
Can I just say we did not consider that in this initial stage, but we are very much going to be expanding this project and looking into various things. So I'm sorry I can't answer that question because we didn't look into that, but just to say anybody else who is listening who is thinking about different things which we probably haven't covered or didn't do, if you drop it in the chat box or wherever, we will be picking up on all of those things.
Excellent, thank you. I'm conscious that we've got a few more questions. Maybe this can be answered easily. Did you include any staff on zero term or 0 hour contracts?
No, we didn't include staff on 0 hours contract because being on 0 hours contract, unfortunately, for shared parental leave automatically disqualifies you. So we kind of set the parameters to cover mothers that were eligible for shared parental leave, but breastfeeding is open, but that's an area that we are also very interested in looking at, although we can pretty much from the picture that we're seeing deduce what will be the position. But yeah, that's something we'll probably consider.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we've just got a couple more minutes. For those of you still sort of with us in the webinar, please do hold on, because we do really want to hear back from you at the end through the final poll as I end the webinar. I'm just going to pick out, we've got a couple of minutes, maybe try and get at least one more question in. Thank you to everybody, Verity, Mark, and Lucy. We covered your question just now. So Verity had asked, I thought there was conflicting case law on whether you had to match SBL, i.e. if you're enhanced maternity pay, you have an enhanced SBL. Has there been a final decision on these cases? Maybe that's a sort of a quick, straightforward answer or not.
There hasn't been yet.
Okay, that's helpful. I shall make sure I get another question here. I'm going, forgive me, Mark, maybe that conversation regarding improving parental leave could be taken through email because you've contributed a lot, Mark. Thank you. I've just got a question here. Are there any examples of how workplaces provide practical support for breastfeeding other than to support mothers to express milk? Often, in terms of context, often babies, if they're in new space, they're not comfortable. So I wondered, you've got about 30 seconds, a minute to answer that. Thank you.
Out of all the universities we looked at, there was one university that had a parents group within the university, within staff. So that's where they could go for questions, peer support, information, and they used to have like parent evenings. So there was only one university which we know of that there was that extra support given.
Yeah, that's true. And but just to flag up that York St. John University are starting a parenthood center in this September, well, by the end of this month, where they will actually be giving support to parents, breastfeeding parents. But apart from that, just like Anjali said, we didn't find anything as such.
Okay, well, look, we've come to 2 o'clock. I want to say, Ernestine, Anjali, thank you so much. That's been really enjoyable. Thank you to everyone who's been with us and contributing in the chat with some really fantastic comments that I know that Ernestine and Anjali will be able to go through after. And also thank you for all the fantastic questions. So I shall end the webinar, and please just take a moment to fill out that final survey. And thank you so much for taking part. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.